Hello, everyone. It is April 17th, 2012. It's Tuesday. It's Harp Tuesday. Haha. Thanks for your suggestions on various topics. I think I have some good ideas for the next bunch of episodes. And this week, what I'm going to talk about is fingering. In the last year, I guess, two of the Harp mailing lists that I subscribe to, there have been some discussion on fingering at various points. And in a way, it's a tough subject because unless you're looking at a specific piece of music, it can be a little hard. But I thought I would just talk briefly about fingering and some of the rules and what makes good fingering and what makes bad fingering bad fingering. And I think in one of the discussions somebody made the analogy of fingering kind of being like grammar, in that one of the best ways to learn it is just reading good writing and being around people who use words correctly and construct sentences with proper grammar, that we get this picture of what good grammar sounds like without necessarily needing to know all the rules. And in a way, I think if you start with a good teacher and you're working with music with good fingering, you build this picture of how fingering works until, and as you work, you need less and less fingering written in. You'll find these large chunks of music where, you know exactly what to do without having to write the fingering in, and eventually be able to, take a piece of music and without any fingering and figure out what would work for that. So, of course, we don't always have the luxury of a good teacher available, and there is definitely music out there that I would consider to have bad fingering. And again, of course, all of this to some extent, is in the eye of the beholder. There's always going to be, you might look at some music and say, I would never finger it that way, and somebody else would say, that's great fingering, or that's terrible fingering, etc. But I'm just going to look at some of the basics of fingering and also try to look at the reasoning behind some of these rules. So let's start very basic, and that is when you're playing a single note. Say we're playing just a single note. Single notes will generally, we want to play that with two, with our first finger. And the reason for that is, first of all, 2 probably has the best control of all of our fingers. As we move down, certainly 4, generally it's a little harder to control it. It's not quite as accurate as 2. 3 is probably pretty close. And the thumb generally has a slightly different sound, so that these 3 fingers are going to sound more similar to each other than the thumb. Not much of a difference, but a little bit of a difference. So by using 2 all the time, it helps. It's more likely to match up with what else is happening as we have other fingered passages. And again, I think just 2 gives us really good control. So again, when you see a single note, you would need something else to be happening in the piece to make it so that you wouldn't finger it with 2. One of the exceptions, of course, is when you're playing something quite low, where, again, my arms are quite long, so I could play this with 2, but I would probably play it with 4. It's just a little bit easier. And it also means that my hand is closer and ready to play something in here, which is probably likely to happen, rather than being all the way down here, where it's more of a leap, say, to come up here. Slightly more efficient. But in general, a single note, you're playing with 2. How about chords and intervals? So we can look and say, well, if you're playing a second or a third, you're generally playing those with 1 and 2. When you get to a fourth, you could play with 1 and 2, or you could play it with 1 and 3. Partly this will depend on what else is happening in the piece. Partly it also depends on your hand. If you have very small fingers and very small hand, you might always want to play this with 1 and 3. I would generally, I have big fingers, big hands. So I'll probably generally play that with 1 and 2. When we get to the 5th, that's 1 and 3. 6th, again, could be 1 and 3 or 1 and 4, depending on comfort and what's going on in the piece. 7th and an 8th will always be 1 and 4. Again, unless, you could play those with 1 and 3 if you needed, say, something, if you needed 4, you needed them to play. If you're looking at, say, a root chord like this, or a first inversion, those are definitely just 3-2-1. The second inversion, again, is generally 3-2-1, but you might find it easier sometimes to play 4-2-1. I would say, in general, unless it's very uncomfortable, I would practice, make sure you can play 3-2-1. If you're looking at something like this, so we get C, G, C, then that's definitely 4-2-1. This could be either 3 or 4, but I would suggest 4. So again, as we start to spread this, if the thumb's down here, then it's fine. This feels pretty good. But as you start to spread this gap, this interval larger, it may start to be more comfortable to use 4 on the bottom. And then, of course, if this bottom interval is small, but this middle interval is large, you're going to be using 3 down here and 1 on top. That's a quick look at some chords and intervals and how you would finger them. But for the most part, I think that's something that probably you already know and isn't too tricky. Then we start to look at fingering in terms of connecting. And connecting is something that's essential in terms of playing things quickly and accurately too. In other words, if we were playing, we could play that just without connecting, or different fingers, but just, and it may feel, for example, when you're first starting, that might feel easier than connecting. But connecting allows us to play something like that so much faster than we ever could if we were playing them as single notes. To the point where it can be almost a solid chord. Whereas that's much, much harder, and we can't get it as fast. Connecting also means that once we've set up, we now know for sure that we're going to play the notes that we want, right? Because we've already found them. Whereas if we're going, or, well, there's a chance, that we might miss, or who knows. So connecting is essential, and what can be puzzling is what fingers do we use for connecting. So let's look at changing directions. So for example, if we had a string of notes, 3 notes, we'd connect 3-2-1 generally, 4 notes, 4-2-1. I'll talk about 5 notes or more in a moment. But let's say, what do we do when we are going, say, up and then down? Or, maybe that's a better idea. So here's a rule, and that is, place all the notes before you start. Place only in one direction, 2 rules, and place all the notes in the direction that you're going before playing the first one. So let's look at that second rule. If we're starting, we want to make sure that we've placed all of these notes before we start playing 4. It can be tempting to maybe go, but by placing everything, that means we're set. We get the advantages of making sure everything's secure, and we can play it as fast as we need to, and it's just good practice. Sometimes, again, all these rules are made to be broken, but when you're learning, this is a great rule to follow, and to make sure that you can do this, to place everything in the direction that you're going before you start playing. So let's look at how that works in terms of going, say, so we're going to play, and now what's happening is we're going to come back down, and so now we're starting in a new direction, right? We've been going up, we've placed everything in that direction before playing this first note, and now we're going to start down, and we're going to place everything in that direction before playing this thumb. So here would be a place where there's a tendency to go, to start down before finding these notes. But then that just slows us down. It forces us to spend some time finding those notes instead of using all that time to go just find all 3 of those notes right away. And that's written using brackets. So in other words, this is actually probably a decent little demonstration. This is Betty Pray's first harp book. Oh, Carolyn's there. This bracket, for example, means that we're placing everything within that bracket before playing the first note. And then it ends, so we come off the string. So we go. And then here's a single note. And then we get another bracket with 3 notes. So we place all of them before playing any of them. And then a single note. And let's ignore the start of this bracket, but at this bottom, you see we have this bracket. And now we've started a new bracket that overlaps this D. That, in other words, what we're going to do, right? Or let's take this. We could put a bracket over all these 4 notes. And then that C, as we get to the top, we'd have this bracket, bracketing that C, but as we get to the top, we'd have another bracket that would start with that C and go down, bracket these next 3 notes plus the C. So we'd see that first bracket, we'd have to place everything within that bracket before playing any of that. Oh, and now this C, as well as being part of that old bracket, is part of a brand new bracket, so before playing it, we have to place everything within that bracket, which turns out to be all of these. So here in this little, what we see is that we've got these first 2 notes, and they're in a bracket, so we have to place both of them. Oh, and now this G, as well as being part of that first bracket, is part of a second bracket, which includes this F below it. So it's just that G and that F. So now, before playing that G, we have to find this F and be ready to play it. So, okay, that's all the notes in that bracket. We get to play this G. Oh, and now this F is also part of a new bracket that includes these 2 notes, this E and this D. So we have to find them before playing the F. And this D is part of a bracket a new bracket that includes these two notes again, this E and this F. Replace these. Oh, and this F is part of a new bracket that includes, that is the F and the G. So, gotta find this G before playing the F. And the final bracket is this G and this A. So, before playing this G, we have to go up and find this A. So, that's what brackets are for. They are the most precise way of indicating how you're finding these notes. A slightly less precise way is just using a phrase marking as fingering. And it can be confusing sometimes because, of course, a phrase marking also means a phrase marking. You know, these are a group of notes that sort of belong together that make kind of a sentence. But usually it'll be clear when they're using it to indicate fingering. And what it just means is that that whole group is connected. And again, as we get more familiar, we would automatically know to supply all these little brackets, right? Like, it's kind of fiddly, but it is essential that we get used to practicing. Place this F before playing the G. Place that E and that D before playing the F. Replace them before playing the D, etc. So let's talk for a moment just about coming off, because that's also very important. And something that I think I see in bad fingerings as well is not only are you maybe the fingerings themselves are not the most efficient, but sometimes they'll have you connecting when you shouldn't. And connecting is good, but if you don't need to connect, you shouldn't, because coming off is good as well. Coming off the string means we're not working at all. We finish working, we can relax. It's a signal to our muscles to relax. That's why, we do this little bit of a wrist, raise of the wrist, and maybe a little bit of a raise of the arm as well. And it helps remind our forearms and the rest of our arms, our body, that, oh yeah, I don't have to be working. I can relax any sort of tension that I have. Just, it's that moment of relaxation. So coming off is very important as well, because in a long, say, some sort of Bach, whatever it is, but you might be playing along, fingering along, never coming off, and that can start to tire out your arm. So when you come to that moment when there's a little bit of a pause, coming off is great. It's a great release and a great relaxation aid. So on any longer notes, you definitely come off, and that's often might be written as a dot. And again, this can be confusing because normally in music we're used to a dot being a staccato note, a sort of sharp, short sounding note talking about the sound. But a dot can often, in terms of fingering, a dot will mean coming off the string. So that in this little, we could, of course, finger and connect back down to this D where we're going to go. But think of all this time we've got. We get 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3. Wow, we've got 2 whole beats there. There's no need to place. We don't need to be fast there. We don't need to worry about, we're going to have lots of time to replace, to place on this D. So we can just come off. 1, 2, 3, 1. We have all the time in the world. So as well as looking at places to connect, also look at places to come off. The longer notes, half notes, unless it's tootling along at some incredible tempo, you're going to be coming off on them. Quarter notes in some pieces, if there's maybe a whole bunch of 16th notes and you get a quarter note, that may be a good time to come off, but looking at places to come off. Um, Placing in order. So I briefly touched on that, but I didn't fully talk about that. And that is, as well as wanting to place all the notes in a particular direction before we start playing. So if we're going up, we're going to place all these notes before we start playing. We're not going to go. And now if we start going down, we're not going to go. The other rule to keep in mind is you only place in the direction you're going. So if you have, let's say, you could, of course, go place all those notes to begin with. And as you look at more advanced music, you may do that. Like, again, these rules are made to be broken. But, particularly if you're just starting, you want to get your hand used to the idea that if you start going up the scale, you just get to keep playing, the lowest finger, followed by the next one, whatever it is that's on the string, and the next one. That we don't have this idea of, oh, and actually we're not playing this 3 yet. Still not playing it. Oh, now we're playing it. Instead, we just want to finger 3-2-1 or 4-2-1. And now again, this rule that there's a bracket here. We're going to place everything in this direction before we get to play the thumb. And of course, like, let's say we could try to do that's actually quite awkward. This works well and would be something that you might do. This is awkward just because of the way it fits under the hand, and you would never do, but is a general rule, especially, again, when you're first starting out. Think of that idea of only place notes in the direction you're going. If you're going up, just place notes that are going up in order. Boop, 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 boop. If you're going down, just place the notes that are going down. So let's just do a little case study of, let's say you're looking at a group of 5 notes in a row. Because obviously, if you're looking at, say, 2 notes, it's pretty easy. If they're wider, again, talked about these intervals, they might be 3-1, etc. If you have 3 notes, 3, 4 notes, the fingering for that is pretty obvious, pretty straightforward. Where we start to run into problems is, what if we're playing 5 or more notes in the same direction? We're going to have to cross over or cross under, depending on whether we're going up or down. So let's imagine that we want to play, C, D, E, F, G. How are we going to finger that? Well, there's actually a surprising number of options available to us. Let's look at a couple ways that we probably would not finger that. One of them is we wouldn't start with 4. And why not? Well, we could, right? That sounds okay. That works. But, as a general rule, we want to make sure that the last note that we play in a section that's going up ends on the thumb. Why is that? Doesn't 2 get us maybe a slightly better sound, more control, blah, 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 blah? Well, it's because what if we want to go down from there? What if we want to go... If we go... It's awkward, we want to train our hand to the idea that when we reach the top of something, we're going to have the thumb on it and we're going to be ready to go back down again. Like, what if we wanted to reach this G? well, we'd have to come off. We wouldn't be able to connect. Whereas if we've had the thumb on top, we're in a perfect position going down to do whatever we need to do. So again, as a general rule, when we're fingering a passage going up, we want to make sure that we end up with a thumb on top. And obviously, well, we can't connect to the thumb because the thumb's already on the string. Coming down, again, we won't want to necessarily end with a thumb, because at the bottom of a note, it's most useful. If we've reached the bottom of a section, we're going to be going back up again. It's most useful and efficient to have 4 on the string, or at least 3, or possibly 2. But the thumb is the most inefficient, because now, we have to jump the greatest amount of distance. So we wouldn't finger it that way. How would we finger it? Well, probably the most traditional way of fingering it would be just 3, 2, 1, crossing under with 2, and then 1. So again, here's a little bracket. We have to place the F before playing the thumb, and then we have to place the thumb before playing the F, before playing 2. This leaves us in a great position to go wherever we want to go from there. Now, you might say, why not do start with 2 and go 3, 2, 1? And you could. There's nothing wrong with that, especially if you're just going in one direction. That's perfectly acceptable. It works. But there's a reason why this is slightly preferred. And that has to do with the fact that it's slightly harder to cross under. It takes a little bit more time. It's a little harder to go cross under than it is to cross over. In general, you'll probably find that you can get something like that going faster than you can get. And you'll see that in pieces that oftentimes, if they want some sort of loud and fast. I think that's Harmonious Blacksmith has stuff like that. Anyway, the downward. The downward crossover is just slightly easier, slightly more efficient. So it makes sense then to give us as much time to set up for the cross under as possible, as opposed to the crossover. In other words, if let's say we're just repeating that little section, by starting with 3, 2, 1, it means that when we come down to the bottom, we now get a reasonable amount of time before we need to do this cross under, which is the most difficult bit of this whole section probably. Whereas if we go 1, 2, we know we have to change around here at the bottom, and then immediately we're going to have to cross under, so that we go from this little change of going down to going up and immediately have to cross under. And it just adds a little bit of extra difficulty to that. So again, we would prefer to have more notes on the bottom rather than more notes grabbed on the bottom rather than more notes grabbed on the top. If that makes sense. In other words, we'd rather grab these 3 notes on the bottom and then these 2 notes on the top, rather than 3 notes on the top and 2 notes on the bottom. But again, if it's just, it might be that we want to do it This way, maybe we're going to go from there to that would actually make a lot more sense than, which works as well. But anyway, something to think about there. And we're not done with this yet, because there's also the possibility, in terms of crossing under, of using 3 in place of 2. So let's say we do this, we're going to do well and good, but we could use 3 to cross under. Why? Well, 4 crossing under is probably the most difficult cross under. But 3 and 2 often will feel interchangeable, and depending on the shape of your hand, how big your fingers are, and just how things feel for you, you may find that it's actually feels more efficient to cross under with 3 rather than 2. So in other words, I would be very surprised if you found crossing under with 4 was more efficient than with either 3 or 2, but it's entirely possible that 3 may feel easier to go than, you may want that little bit of extra room. 3 gives us a little bit of extra room here. Whereas this may just feel a little bit too cramped, so you may find that you want to cross under with 3. And I know for me, I have a slight tendency to find the crossing under with 3 to be a little bit more efficient. There's a section in the Bach that I'm working on right now where we have this quite fast passage. Whatever it is. I find it better to do rather than, so 2-1, 3-1 rather than 2-1, 2-1. But that's just me, again. So be aware of that, play around with it, and obviously if you're going up and down, say, because it doesn't make sense going down, you'd always just use 2. You never go 1, 3, 1, 2, 3. So if you were repeating this little thing, you would want to cross under with 2. But if it's a single one-time deal, you might find it easier to cross under with 3. And again, just this little thing of 5 notes, as you get more advanced, again, these general rules are good to follow in the beginning because they form that great basis of our grammar, of how our idea of how fingering works. But then when you're ready to break some of these rules, you might cross under with 3 and play 2 at the finish. And again, I said generally, we want to finish with the thumb on the top and 4 on the bottom, or the lowest, the lowest finger possible. But we might want this slightly different sound of ending with 2 on the top. Again, that's that's a consideration, but I would say something that if you're at the point where you're thinking about that, you probably don't need this video is probably not going to be that useful for you. You already have a good sense of fingering and what to do. And there are still other ways we can finger this 5-note passage, and that has to do with slides, of course. in that we can do a slide on the fourth finger on the bottom, or going down, we could slide going down. And I did an episode on slides. Obviously, if you were doing this repeating pattern, the sliding would probably be somewhat awkward. If you're doing a one-time thing, especially going down, because I think for most of us our thumb slides are more secure, we do them more often, you know, that's probably going to be the fastest way to play those 5 notes, because it's as if we have them all connected rather than right. That's faster, louder, more even. Going up, my fourth finger slide is, I don't end up using it very often, so it's not that great. But if you practiced it, you could probably get something that's better than the equivalent of fingering. The other consideration, just as you might for some reason want to end with 2 for that sound, I personally prefer to avoid slides generally, just because I don't like the sound that it produces quite as much as a normal playing normally, so that I'd rather finger something like that unless it's quite fast. Now there's one final way we could finger those 5 notes, and that is placing C, D, E, and the G on top, playing, and then moving up and playing this next note with 2. And this, of course, only refers to going up. And I think I talked about that in the episode on transcribing music for the harp, where I looked at one of the movements from the Bach partita that I'm working on, I think, and something like that, where for these wider spreads, it can be a more efficient way than trying to finger that. And also, if you don't have a lot of room, because to cross under requires some room between the thumb and the finger that's crossing under. If you're way up here on the top of the harp, and the example I think I used in that case was for Capriccio Espagnol, the harp part for the orchestra piece. Those are notes. Again, to try to finger under there's so little room, at least on my harp, that it's easier to do. But again, that's just a trick and not something that I would recommend using in general. So, well, this has been yikes, almost 40 minutes, so I think I should close things off now. But hopefully this has given you some things to think about just in terms of fingering. And take care, and I will see you in 2 weeks' time. Cheers.